Okay, bonjour tout le monde, welcome. So just to be sure you are in the right workshop, it's the IRCC Recent Research Insight. So if you are not in the right workshop, you can still change, otherwise stay with us. I am Cédric de Chardon. I'm currently the Director of Policy Research in the Research and Evaluation branch at IRCC, Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship branch. So one good thing this year is I don't have to tell you where are the washroom and what are the issue, emergency exit in the room, because I hope you know. So now the description of this workshop to be sure you know where you are. So IRCC continues to work to enhance its capacity to report on and analyze the outcomes and impact of immigrants and refugees with increased availability of administrative data, including strategic data enhancement and linkages. Research has been able to address some long-standing knowledge gaps and produce evidence for the purpose of policy and program decision-making. This workshop will provide an overview of the current research plan, as well as highlight from 3 recent completed research projects focused on the impact of COVID-19 on immigrants, the expansion of two-step selection, and the long-term labor market integration of refugee claimants. Okay, so all presentation will be in English, but the Q&As at the end could be both in English and French for sure. We will translate and we will answer usually in English, but some of our participants can answer in French. This past year was an important one for P2P as well as for IRCC. So as you know, IRCC is now funding P2P to continue its excellent work for the sector, for Canadians as well as for newcomers. This past year also I had again the privilege to manage a very talented team of analysts. Some of them are here today, not all of them. Since the COVID-19 struck, P2P conference had to be virtual. So the bad thing is that we won't be able to connect directly together. I already know and appreciate some of you, and others we have met for the first time. But the positive thing is you won't have to suffer from my awful accent for the first and maybe the last time in years. So although we speak and we speak more, so that will be better, and we won't have to connect in English otherwise. So on this positive note, let me introduce my talented team of analysts and their manager. So in order of appearance for the presentation, there will be Rebeka Lee. Rebeka, yes. Rebeka is currently an acting assistant director in the policy research division in the Research and Evaluation branch at IRCC. With a background in political studies and education, Rebeka has previously worked as a secondary school teacher and a senior youth worker, working with at-risk children and youth and newcomer families in Ottawa. Her work in the federal government has focused primarily on the socioeconomic outcome of immigrants and refugees and settlement services funded by IRCC. You can raise your hand, Rebeka, so just in case, but I think people see your name, Okay, that's very old school from me. Drew Zhang is a research analyst in the Policy Research Division at IRCC too, for sure. And prior to joining IRCC, Drew has worked as a research analyst at Statistics Canada after graduating with a PhD in economics from University of Waterloo in December 2017. During her work and graduate studies, Drew has conducted various immigration-related analyses, such as innovation impact of STEM immigrants, immigrant labor market integration, and citizenship policies in Canada. Eden Crossman is a senior research analyst in the Policy Research Division at IRCC. With a background in economics, she has been focusing on labor market research for over 20 years within the federal government. Eden has previously worked on economic and social issues, including low income, women in the labor market, foreign credential recognition, and immigrant labor market outcomes and impact. Last but not least, Yasmin Gore is a research analyst too in the Policy Research Division at IRCC, working as the lead on the refugee research portfolio. In her role, she uses statistical data to analyze the socioeconomic outcomes of resettled refugees and refugee claimants in Canada. She holds an honors Bachelor of Social Sciences in Economics from the University of Ottawa and a master's degree in Economics from Carleton University. Also, more here for answer question on Eden's project at the end. Fang Hu is with us and will be able to answer some questions. Yeah, hello Fang. Since he co-authored the research paper with Eden. But he also has a vast amount of knowledge in statistics and immigration, so he can answer other questions. And the tough question we agreed upon before will be for him. Hello, Fang. Fengu is a principal researcher with social analysis and modeling division at Statistics Canada and adjunct professor of sociology at the University of Victoria and University of Western Ontario. He holds a PhD in social demography from the University of Western Ontario. His research focuses on the socioeconomic integration of immigrants and the second generation, dynamics of social diversity, minority-majority social interaction, and subjective well-being. So just, I'm almost done. Since with my dear colleague Li Chu from Statistics Canada, last year we introduced a new model of co-authorship, and you see the outcomes today. The three today's presentation were based on co-published papers between IRCC and Statistics Canada, great collaboration with from Statistics Canada analyst and IRCC analyst, and that's what they will present you today in form of deck. Now some final words, and I'm really done for this with this lengthy introduction. For the question on Slido, you can, so the code is P2P 2020, P2P 2020, and you can start to write your question in order not to forget them. It happens all the time to me. So try to write them as soon as they come, but we will just answer all the questions at the end. So if you could also indicate who would be the best to answer in your opinion, 1 or 2%, it will help us to know who will be the person for your question. So now I will pass the microphone to Rebeka for 10 minutes, then every one of the analysts for 15 minutes, and we have 15 minutes for the Q&A at the end. So up to you, Rebeka. Merci.
My name is Rebeka Lee. I'm the Acting Assistant Director for the Policy Research Division. We have a really exciting workshop here this afternoon, so I'll keep my presentation relatively short and sweet, as I feel like the 3 other presenters have much more interesting things to say. I'll be going over our policy research team mandate, kind of what we do and how we do it. In addition, I'll quickly just highlight our departmental results framework and how it kind of guides our work. And then prior to going into some select economic outcomes, we'll just quickly highlight the historic immigration levels and mix. Certainly we're at a crossroads, as the P2P conference is highlighting. And then with that, I'll end with what some of our recently completed research projects are and our forward agenda. So we have a small but mighty research team, I like to say. We're about 10 analysts right now. And research at IRCC is mostly a centralized function. So we develop and implement a research program with the aim to deepen our understanding of immigration policies, including outcomes and impacts. In addition to that, we work to articulate and contextualize recent research findings to advance their proper use and provide new insights to strengthen policy and program decision-making. We produce both in-house work, and as Cédric mentioned in the introduction, we've been exploring a co-authorship model with our dear colleagues at Statistics Canada, in addition to commissioning or contracting out research projects. As part of our work, we're also working closely with data colleagues when possible in order to advance data development projects for research purposes. I don't think there is a single workshop today that's not mentioning COVID, and certainly COVID has very much impacted our work, the way we work, as well as the things that we work on. So not only have we pivoted to working remotely and having to troubleshoot remote data access and accessing our files, we've also seen this as an opportunity of looking at different areas of research. Dre, who's presenting right after me, in collaboration with Fung and Garnet Picot, have looked at, some of the early COVID impacts on immigrant outcomes. So as mentioned, IRCC departmental results framework, and I'm kind of just showing this to you to explain, how our team is organized. Traditionally, we've focused a lot more of our work on the immigrant and refugee selection and integration, so what is the middle column. But as the immigration landscape has changed over the years, we've kind of expanded our research scope as well, specifically looking a lot more at the international students and temporary workers. And then Eden and Fung have worked on two-step migration, so looking at those who transition from temporary status to permanent residency. So for context, in 2019, Canada admitted over 340,000 permanent residents. Our department recently announced the 2021 Immigration Levels Plan, where we'll be hoping to admit over 401,000 immigrants. It's important to note that permanent residents are brought to Canada for different reasons as well. So the outcomes will be different, and that's something that's important to keep in mind when we're comparing outcomes of each group. So, immigrant outcomes in the Canadian labour market. This comes from Census 2016, and the advantage that Census gives us is we're now able to look at outcomes by immigration category. So when we look at economic principal applicants, they participate in the labour market at a higher rate than the Canadian-born population. The Canadian-born population here is indicated by the dashed line on each of the graphs. And the unemployment rate for economic principal applicants is on par with the Canadian average. And as I previously mentioned, we bring in PRs, permanent residents, for different reasons. So as permanent residents who are not selected for primarily economic reasons, refugees and sponsored family class immigrants report lower participation and employment rates. So moving on. Looking at employment earnings over time, we see that economic principal applicants' employment earnings are well above the average for all immigrants and surpass the Canadian average shortly after landing. Among refugees, employment earnings were lower than the average for all immigrants and remain below the Canadian average even 15 years after landing. Another immigrant outcome that we like to look at is the use of social assistance over time. So the incidence of social assistance generally declines for all immigrant categories with the exception of sponsored family class. And the use of social assistance among sponsored family class immigrants increases after their 10th year. This reflects the impact of sponsorship agreements, which typically end after 10 years. Among refugees who initially report receiving social assistance at a higher rate than other immigrants, there is a significant decline over time as their labor market outcomes improve and they become increasingly self-sufficient. So some of the key takeaways here, immigrants, particularly economic principal applicants, have strong positive outcomes. And despite being admitted to Canada on a humanitarian basis, refugees become increasingly self-sufficient with more time in Canada. Overall, immigrants and refugees are doing quite well. They participate in the labor market, they find jobs, and over time, they're earning more and using social assistance less. These successes are results of a joint effort among the federal and provincial territorial governments, external stakeholders, including service provider organizations, and this is something that we really feel needs to be maintained. So in terms of our research plan moving forward, we have a few pieces that were recently completed on international students and temporary foreign workers. One of them being regulatory approaches to international labor recruitment in Canada. And then Statistics Canada co-authored a paper, Are Canadian Companies Transient or Persistent Users of Temporary Foreign Workers? And then Yasmin will actually be presenting on the long-term labor market integration of refugee claimants who became permanent residents. Moving forward this year, we have a big focus on international students. We have a qualitative study that's currently out in the field that's going to look at the labor market experiences of former international students and comparing them to their Canadian-born counterparts. And this has actually been adapted with the COVID, in the COVID context, since we're seeing less international students and there might be additional barriers that they're facing. We're also putting together an overview paper on international students as a source of labor supply. This is a comprehensive piece that will be co-authored with Statistics Canada as well. And then on the immigrant and refugee selection and integration side, so this is a pretty long list. I will say you're welcome to contact me following if you wanted access to these. Some of them, any of the ones that are in collaboration with StatsCan, you can usually find them published on the Statistics Canada website as well. I'll note here the second project, expansion of two-step selection, is what Eden will be speaking of this afternoon. And then the three last projects on the bottom are official language projects. And so there is going to be a workshop tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock where the authors of this will be presenting. So I highly encourage you to check that out. And then in terms of forward plans, one of our more exciting projects this year, although I will say all of these projects are very exciting, is we're re-examining factors best predicting the employment earnings of economic immigrants. And this will help us further refine our selection, improve our express entry program. And then finally, I will conclude since I'm being told I'm out of time shortly. So just a reminder, this isn't an exhaustive list of research projects. We wanted to highlight some of the things that we think are probably most interesting to the audience today. And with COVID, we're constantly pivoting as well, since we want to be responsive to internal departmental priorities. And of course, as mentioned, StatsCan is constantly working to make more data available to us as well. One of the challenges that persists for us is researching and understanding the social and cultural outcomes of impacts of immigrants. Some of you may have noted that when I talked about outcomes, I focused largely on the economic outcomes. In a lot of ways, they're much easier for us to measure, and we have the data available to us. And then one final thing to percolate on is the immigration continuum has expanded and changed in recent years. We're seeing a lot more TRs in general, temporary residents, which includes temporary foreign workers and international students. And we're seeing a lot more of them transition to permanent residency. So our research agenda aims as best it can to cover this entire continuum. Thank you so much. I'll pass this off to Joya now.
Thanks for Cédric's opening remark and Rebeka's overview. Today, I'm going to present a joint paper with Feng Ho from Statistics Canada and Garnet Pickle from IRCC. So the title today is The Transitions into and Out of Employment by Immigrants During the COVID-19 Lockdown and Recovery. And we know during the widespread lockdown of economic activities in March and April 2020, the Canadian labor market lost about 3 million jobs. And from May to September, as the business gradually resumed their operations, 75% of the jobs were recovered. So in the United States and Europe, they find that immigrants are often more severely affected by economic downturns than the native born. However, little is known in Canada. So in this research, we raised the questions, did immigrants and the Canadian born fare differently in the employment disruption induced by the COVID-19 pandemic? And if they did, how such differences are related to their social demographic and job characteristics. And there are some reasons to expect a more severe COVID-19 impact on immigrants in Canada. And the first one is recent immigrants tend to have shorter job tenure than the Canadian born. And research really find that workers with shorter tenure are more susceptible to layoffs during an economic downturn. And for example, in February, before the impact of the pandemic, 31% of employed recent immigrants had been in their jobs for less than 1 year. And this is compared to only 15% among the Canadian-born workers. And recent immigrants are often much more likely to work in low-paying jobs than the Canadian-born workers. For example, 22% of recent immigrants were in low-paid jobs, compared with only 12% among Canadian-born workers. And the employment losses in March and April, based on the previous research, were heavily concentrated among lower paying jobs. And more broadly, recent immigrants, they really have more difficulty in transferring their educational job qualifications in the labor market, and this difficulty prevent them from finding a good, steady jobs. So the data used in this research is basically the monthly labor force, and the monthly survey covers over 50,000 households. This boils down to around 100,000 individuals in the labor market and collected in this survey. And also this study focuses on the population age between 20 and 64. And in this study, immigrants are grouped into two major groups. One is the recent immigrants who arrived in Canada within 10 years and long-term immigrants who arrived in Canada more than 10 years. And in this study, the monthly sample size for recent immigrants is about 4,000, long-term immigrants about 8,000, and for the Canadian-born about 50,000. According to the chart, prior to the lockdown, the rate of transition to non-employment was low and similar among all the three population groups, fluctuating between 2% and 4% over February 2019 to February 2020. And as the pandemic hit, the rate suddenly jumped for all three groups. But this is much more so among the recent immigrants, peaking in April at around 17% and 13 or 14% for the Canadian-born and long-term immigrants. And from April to September, as the economy began to recover, the rate declined for all three groups. And the second major finding in this study is that female recent immigrants experienced the largest increase in the rate of transition to non-employment during the contraction. So almost 20% of female recent immigrants employed in March were not employed in April, compared with 7 percentage points higher than among the Canadian-born women. And the gap mostly disappeared since July. And the third major finding is that recent immigrants had lower rates of transition from non-employment to employment at the start of the partial recovery. So this is basically mean recent immigrants had lower rates of regaining the jobs during the partial recovery. And from February 2019 to April 2020, the three groups actually has similar rates of transition into employment, with the recent immigrants have a slightly higher rate than the Canadian-born in most months. And as the transition to employment increased during the partial recovery, and recent immigrants had transition rates that were 5 percentage points lower than those of the Canadian-born individuals in May and 3 points in June. And the last but not the least important finding is that the rate of transition into employment during recovery was particularly low among the recent immigrant women. And according to the chart, we see that recent immigrant women had the largest gap with their Canadian-born counterparts at 5 percentage points in both May and June, and 2 percentage points from July to September. And these gaps are even larger after we taking into account of their differences with the Canadian-born women in terms of age, education, and geographical location. And these gaps were likely driven by differential employment growth between recent immigrant and Canadian-born women by industrial sector and wage level. So here we dig further by constructing the regression model to examine the extent to which the gap between immigrants and the Canadian-born in the rate of transition out of employment was accounted for by their differences in social demographic and job characteristics. So what we find mainly here is the shorter job tenure and overrepresentation in lower wage jobs are the key reasons for the stronger COVID effect on recent immigrants. So here are the conclusions. During the March to April contraction, recent immigrants had higher rates of transition out of employment than the Canadian-born, although they had similar rates prior to the downturn. And the differences was mainly attributable to recent immigrants' higher shares holding lower paying jobs and shorter tenure jobs. And in the initial months of the recovery, recent immigrants, particularly women, had lower rates of transition from non-employment to employment than their Canadian-born counterparts. And thank you. This is my presentation. And here you can access the report through the website. Thank you.
Okay, so my name is Eden Crossman, and I'm a senior research analyst with the Research and Evaluation Branch with Cédric and Rebeka and the whole team. And as Cédric said, I'm here with my co-author, Feng Hu from Statistics Canada, and we also have a third co-author, Garnet Pico, but he's unable to be with us today. Just for the sake of expediency, I'm going to be the one doing the entire presentation today, but both Feng and I are happy to discuss any questions at the end. So just as a bit of background, this presentation is based on a research project aimed at providing a broad overview of the increasing importance of temporary foreign workers in the selection and labor market outcomes of new immigrants, or what we call two-step immigration. The results of this research were published this past summer in 5 separate articles, which can be found on the Statistics Canada webpage. So the purpose of today's presentation is to examine and document some key aspects of two-step immigration selection, to explore the links between two-step immigration and the labor market outcomes of immigrants, paying attention to admission category, and to discuss the benefits and potential challenges associated with two-step immigration selection, as well as consider the factors needed for its continued success. Next slide, please. So why were we motivated to do this research? What we're calling two-step immigration selection has expanded rapidly in Canada. Two-step immigration selection refers to the selection of economic immigrants from among temporary foreign workers. So in the first step, employers play a major role in recruiting and evaluating temporary foreign workers. And in the second step, the government decides how many and which temporary foreign workers are eligible for permanent residency, although employers still play a very large role in some provincial nominee programs. It's important to note that two-step selection in Canada is different from the employer-sponsored economic immigration in the US. In the US, employers play a key role both in the first and second steps, because a temporary foreign worker's application for permanent residency typically has to be sponsored by the employer. But Canada's two-step selection maintains government control in the second step. So the Canadian system has a built-in mechanism to mitigate some of the potential challenges that are associated with two-step selection, and we'll touch upon those later. So in 2018, 59% of economic principal applicants had worked in Canada before immigration, as shown by them having pre-immigration Canadian earnings. And that was a large increase from just 12% in 2000. You can see in the graph on this page that different economic immigration programs use two-step immigration selection differently. So for instance, almost all Canadian experienced class principal applicants had pre-immigration Canadian earnings. This program was designed for this purpose. Among federal skilled workers, the share with pre-immigration Canadian earnings went up and down, but was below 20% in most years. And about 62% of provincial programs had pre-immigration Canadian earnings, a large increase from 11% in 2000. Next slide, please. So what drove the expansion of two-step selection? There's 3 main factors. The first is the large increase in the number of temporary foreign workers. Between 2000 and 2018, the number of temporary work permit holders in Canada increased 6-fold. Second, more temporary foreign workers have transitioned to permanent residency. And the third factor is related to changes in immigration programs. Provincial programs have expanded and accounted for close to 1/2 of economic immigrants in 2018. And as we showed on the previous slide, provincial programs have increasingly relied on temporary foreign workers. And of course, the introduction of the Canadian Experience Class in 2008 was another major change. Next slide, please. Now we turn to the question about how two-step immigration is related to recent trends in immigrant labor market outcomes. Here, we're looking at first-year employment incidents, we define annual employment incidents as a share of immigrant tax filers who reported at least $500 of employment income in a given tax year. As this graph shows, there are very large differences in first-year employment incidences among immigrants by level of pre-immigration Canadian earnings. Essentially, all immigrants who had medium or high pre-immigration Canadian earnings continued to be employed in the first full year after immigration. High pre-immigration Canadian earnings here refer to annual earnings over $50,000. Medium refers to annual earnings between $20,000 and $50,000. And low pre-immigration Canadian earnings refer to annual earnings below $20,000. When we compare immigrant groups, perhaps not surprisingly, those who had no pre-immigration Canadian earnings had a much lower employment incidence. So that's the orange line that you see at the bottom of that graph. If we look at overall trend, so here you're looking at the dashed line labeled all, you can see that between 2000 and 2016, the first full year employment incidence increased 6 percentage points for immigrant men. And although we don't show it here, it increased 5 percentage points for immigrant women. Over the same period, the employment rates for the Canadian-born population remained basically flat. So the improvement in the employment incidence is unique to new immigrants. In our analysis, we found that 2/3 of the increases in new immigrants' employment incidences are accounted for by the rising share of immigrants with pre-immigration Canadian earnings. Changes in other characteristics of immigrants, such as education, knowledge of official languages, and immigration class, had very little impact. How long do the effects last? Well, we also looked at what happened 10 years after immigration among those who arrived over the 2000 to 2005 period. In terms of employment incidence, immigrants with pre-immigration Canadian earnings still had a 4 to 8 percentage point advantage over immigrants who were admitted directly from abroad, depending on the level of pre-immigration Canadian earnings. So two-step selection also has direct long-term advantages in employment. Next step, please. When it comes to immigrant earnings, we see similar patterns. There are large differences in entry earnings among immigrants with different levels of pre-immigration Canadian earnings. So entry earnings here refer to earnings in the first year after the landing year. Right away, you can see in this graph that immigrants with high pre-immigration Canadian earnings stand out. So that's the blue line that is above all the other lines. They earn 2 to 4 times more than immigrants who are admitted directly from abroad. That's the orange line near the bottom. With respect to the decline you can see in the blue line in the annual earnings of high wage earners who are principal applicants, multivariate analysis showed that it was primarily associated with changes in 3 socio-demographic characteristics: education, source region, and landing age. That said, between the 2000 and 2016 entry cohorts, average entry earnings increased 23% among all immigrant men. And again, we haven't shown it here, but 32% among women. Over 90% of the increase in entry earnings is associated with the rising share of immigrants with medium and high levels of pre-immigration Canadian earnings. And again, changes in other immigration selection factors had little impact on the recent trend in earnings. We also found there's a long-term advantage. 10 years after immigration, immigrants with high pre-immigration Canadian earnings still earn twice as much as immigrants without pre-landing Canadian earnings. Immigrants with medium pre-immigration Canadian earnings still earn 13% more. And those with low pre-immigration Canadian earnings actually saw their advantage grow with time, from 5% higher earnings in the first year after immigration to 9% by the 10th. And again, these are the findings after we controlled for socio-demographic characteristics. Next slide, please. So two-step selection also helps us to understand different labor market outcomes among immigrants in different admission programs. CEC and P&P immigrants had much higher observed employment incidences than federal skilled worker immigrants in the first year, but also in the 5th year after immigration. So here we're looking at the 2009 to 2012 cohort at 5 years after immigration. You can see that the employment incidence for CEC immigrants was 6 percentage points higher than that of federal skilled workers. So we're comparing the blue dashed bars between the two categories. Excuse me. And you can see that for PNP immigrants, the incidence of employment was 5 percentage points higher. We found that about 40 to 60% of CEC and PNP advantages in employment are related to their higher shares with pre-immigration Canadian earnings relative to immigrants in the federal skilled worker program. Next slide, please. Okay, so a lot of the differences we see among the different admission categories are due to a higher share of PNP and CEC immigrants with medium or high levels of pre-immigration Canadian earnings. Previous studies have found that PNP and CEC immigrants have better earnings outcomes than federal skilled workers, at least during the early years after landing in Canada. And this is still the case among 2009 to 2012 arrivals. But you can see in this graph that 5 years after immigration, federal skilled worker and CEC immigrants had essentially the same post-immigration earnings if they had had the same level of pre-immigration Canadian earnings. 5 years after immigration, PNP immigrants, on the other hand, had significantly lower earnings than federal skilled workers. One possible explanation for this is that PNP immigrants may be more likely to be selected into medium and low skilled jobs that tend to have slow earnings growth. We found that over 90% of CEC advantages in earnings are related to their higher shares of pre-immigration Canadian earnings relative to federal skilled workers. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to turn to some discussion about the benefits and potential challenges associated with two-step immigration. Some of the key advantages to this type of immigration include a better match between immigrant skills and labor market demands, because employers can directly assess temporary foreign workers' skills and intangible qualities, so things like drive and motivation. Temporary foreign workers can test out life in Canada before they decide whether they want to become permanent residents. And temporary foreign workers who performed well are unlikely to have difficulty having their work experience and credentials recognized. And two-step selection is often regarded as an efficient way to fill a specific regional or sectoral labor market need. But what about the possible challenges? We also need to consider that there are possible negative consequences, and if so, we need to find ways to reduce them. One potential risk is that some temporary foreign workers may be subject to exploitation and poor working conditions. Temporary foreign workers may also displace domestic workers and put downward pressure on wages. And relying on a large supply of low-cost foreign workers may also reduce incentives for employers and governments to improve training for domestic workers. Furthermore, employers in search of cheap labor may prioritize short-term demand over longer-term competitiveness. So employer-sponsored immigration programs are not effective in addressing the long-term needs of the labor market and broader economy. Next slide, please. So going forward, the following trends need to be closely monitored. The number of temporary foreign workers in Canada. In theory, such a program should rise and fall with labor market demand. If it doesn't, there's a risk of displacement, lower wages, and higher unemployment rates. We want to watch the types of temporary foreign workers who become permanent residents. We saw earlier, there's been a decline in first-year earnings among those with high pre-immigration Canadian earnings, suggesting that there have been some changes in the pre-landing characteristics of two-step immigrants over time. We want to monitor the diversity of temporary foreign workers who become permanent residents. We want to ensure two-step immigration does not create or reinforce any gendered, racial, or class biases in society. And finally, we want to keep track of the outcomes of temporary foreign workers who become permanent residents in the short and long term. We need to consider how adaptable these individuals are to changing labor market conditions. Next slide, please. So this concludes our overview of some of the key aspects of two-step immigration and the associated labor market outcomes. We saw that two-step immigration has expanded rapidly. and that immigrants who went through selection have higher employment incidences and earnings both at entry and in the long term. In fact, the expansion of two-step selection accounted for most of the recent improvement in new immigrants' employment and earnings. Two-step selection also explains much of the differences in labor market outcomes across economic immigration programs. We also discussed the need for monitoring trends related to two-step immigration, because anything that might affect the labor market outcomes of immigrants selected via this process, or the perception by Canadians of immigration, could present a challenge. And finally, we plant the thought that the positive labor market outcomes associated with the two-step immigration selection approach is suggestive of an opportunity to improve the economic immigrant selection process. And I'll end there. Thank you all for listening, and Fung and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Eden. That was great. You were on time, just 10 seconds more, that's just perfect. So before going to Yasmin Gouré and the long-term labor market integration of refugee claimants who became permanent residents in Canada, I just would like, I saw some of the three-dot questions, so thank you. You are starting to ask for questions, but if you could indicate who should first try to answer your question in Slido, if it's for all or for one researcher in particular, it will be helpful to manage it later. So otherwise, Yasmin, if you are ready, we are ready to listen to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's workshop. My name is Yasmin Gour, and like my colleagues before me, I am a research analyst at IRCC's Research and Evaluation branch in the Policy Research Division. So today I'm going to be presenting a paper on the long-term labor market outcomes of refugee claimants in Canada. It is a very recently published paper, as in just last week. So I'm very happy to share this. It was done in collaboration with Statistics Canada with Mark Frenette and Yu-Chen Liu. So just to go over an outline of the presentation today, I'm going to begin first with the objective of the report. I will go into some background and provide some contextual information on IRCC's refugee programs. I will discuss very briefly the methodology for the report. I'll also go into the socio-demographic characteristics of our sample group in the study. And then I will discuss the key findings, which is the main event. And I will wrap everything up in the concluding remarks. So, although refugees are not admitted to Canada for humanitarian reasons, we are interested in their labor market outcomes because it does play an important role in successful integration. So in this study, we compared the long-term labor market outcomes of refugee claimants to resettled refugees. And to take it a step further, we also compared the long-term labor market outcomes of refugee claimants that did not become permanent residents to those that did become permanent residents. And this is important to highlight because within IRCC, we have a wealth of information on refugee claimants after they become permanent residents, but we don't have as much information on claimants when they are awaiting a decision on their claim. And so for us, this represented a knowledge gap and something that we wanted to be able to better understand. And to my knowledge, this would be the first time that we've been comparing refugee claimants before they become permanent residents with their counterparts that did become permanent residents, and as well as resettled refugees that also landed during that period. So to go over the refugee programs at IRCC, although I expect this isn't new information for many of you. There are two streams that refugees are admitted to in Canada. The first one being the Refugee and Humanitarian Resettlement Program, where refugees are selected either as government-assisted refugees who are referred by the UNHCR and supported through the federally funded Resettlement Assistance Program, or as privately sponsored refugees who are sponsored and supported by voluntary groups in Canada. The second program is the In Canada Asylum Program, in which Canada provides refugee protection for individuals who are in Canada and have a well-founded fear of persecution in their home country. And adjudication of their claim is made by the Immigration and Refugee Board, and it's based on whether they meet the United Nations definition of a convention refugee, or if they're a person in need of protection based on the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, or IRBA. So in terms of the methodology for this report, the data came from the Longitudinal Immigration Database, or the IMDb, which is a data set that combines immigrant landing data with their tax data. So from this data set, we are able to obtain earnings information on an immigrant from the first year that they file taxes and every year after they file taxes onwards. And so this is a very rich data set, goes back all the way to 1982, in which we can really get a full picture of how immigrants are integrating over time and at different points in time and compared to other cohorts, etc. For this particular study, the sample group for our long-term analysis focused on refugee claimants who initiated their claim in 2003 and filed a tax return in the following year in 2004, were between the ages of 25 and 44 during the study period, and filed taxes every year from 2004 until 2016. For resettled refugees, slight modification, it was those who landed in 2003, also filed taxes in the following year in 2004, were in the same group of 25 and 44 years old, and also filed taxes every year from 2004 until 2016. So to go over some socio-demographic characteristics of our sample group, this is very important to highlight because these characteristics will impact the outcomes that we see in the subsequent slides. So it's important to get an idea of what our sample group is. So these are the 4 groups that will be assessed in the study: refugee claimants who became permanent residents, refugee claimants who did not become permanent residents during the study period, government-assisted refugees, and privately sponsored refugees. So beginning first with gender, we see that refugee claimants were slightly more likely to be male than resettled refugees. We saw that in terms of age, they were all generally around the same average age of about 32 years old. In terms of education, we saw that refugee claimants in this particular sample group, so landed in, or initiated a claim, I should say, in 2003, were particularly educated. So 25% had a bachelor's degree or higher, compared to 14.3% for government-assisted refugees and 8% for privately sponsored refugees. So that's very exceptional because, to put it into context, in 2016, based on the census data, we saw that just under a quarter of the Canadian-born population had a bachelor's degree or higher. So this is a particularly educated group for refugee claimants. And lastly, in terms of world region, we also see that refugee claimants were more likely to be from South and Central America, while resettled refugees were more likely to be from Africa and the Middle East. Estimated 66 to 68% of refugee claimants received social assistance in their first year after arrival. I'm getting a notification, but hopefully that won't be a problem. Refugee claimants received social assistance in their first year after arrival, compared to 18% for privately sponsored refugees and almost 92% for government-assisted refugees. 13 years later, we found that refugee claimants who became permanent residents were the least likely of all refugee groups to receive social assistance at 11.4%, and claimants who did not become permanent residents, were not far behind at 11.6%. And with all refugee groups, we do expect to see a decline with time in Canada in terms of social assistance receipt. So we do see that for the resettled refugees as well, at about 14.3% for privately sponsored refugees and 27.2% for government-assisted refugees. Now going into the actual amount of social assistance received in terms of average social assistance per family member, we saw that in the initial years after arrival, refugee claimants received more in social assistance income per family member than resettled refugees. However, 13 years later, refugee claimants that became permanent residents received less in social assistance income than both privately sponsored refugees and government-assisted refugees. For refugee claimants that did not become permanent residents, they were receiving the most in social assistance income. So there's a pretty big gap there between those that transition to permanent residency and those that do not. Now looking at employment earnings, we see that among claimants who did not become permanent residents during the study period, the share with employment income increased from 49% in the first year after arrival to 63% 4 years later. So a consistent rise that's reflective of other refugee groups. But the difference here is that we see for claimants that don't become permanent residents, their earnings tend to decline and then remain fairly stagnant for the remainder of the study period. So by the end of the 13-year period, about 53% of refugee claimants with outstanding status were reporting employment income. In comparison, what we saw was that the incidence of employment earnings, or the share of refugee claimants who became permanent residents that had employment earnings, continued to steadily increase. And by the end of the 13-year period, it was 83%. And that was higher than the share reported for both government-assisted refugees at 72% and privately sponsored refugees at just under 80%. So again, just to highlight there, a very big gap between refugee claimants that became permanent residents and those that did not become permanent residents. And to go into the average employment earnings earned during this period, we saw that 1 year after arrival, refugee claimants reported average employment earnings of just over $15,000 1 year after arrival. This was compared to government-assisted refugees at $11,000 and about $20,000 for privately sponsored refugees. So for all immigrant groups, including refugees, we typically see average employment earnings will increase with time. And this is reflected in the chart as well. What we found, though, was for refugee claimants that did not become permanent residents, there is a consistent increase in the initial years, and then it tapers off and does not increase at the same rate as other refugees that do have permanent resident status. So by the end of the 13-year period, refugee claimants without landing status reported employment earnings of $24,000 compared to about $35,000 for claimants who became permanent residents, which was similar to the amount reported for privately sponsored refugees at $35,000 and $32,000 for government-assisted refugees. So again, a fairly big gap between refugee claimants that become permanent residents and those that do not. One other thing that I do want to highlight as well is that in the initial years of arrival, we do see a pretty big gap between the four refugee groups in terms of their average employment earnings. But with time in Canada, we see that their earnings more or less merge together, at least for this specific sample group. So it does kind of point to the idea that perhaps admission category plays more of a role in the initial years and less so of an impact later on. Just to touch very briefly on the multivariate analysis. So when we look at the socio-demographic characteristics in the slides earlier back in the presentation, we saw that there were some pretty big differences between refugee claimants and resettled refugees. We saw that refugee claimants were much more likely to be educated. We saw a slightly higher share of them being male. And these are factors that are going to impact their labor market outcomes. So in a way, the descriptive analysis is comparing apples to oranges, even though they are refugee groups amongst each other. But what the multivariate analysis does is it raises the question of, if we held all of those individual characteristics constant, would we see a difference in outcomes? And how much of those individual characteristics explain their outcomes? So we completed a regression analysis to answer that question. And we held gender, age, educational attainment, and region of birth constant in our study. And what we found was that in the initial descriptive analysis, it seemed as if refugee claimants did slightly better than resettled refugees long-term. But after doing the multivariate analysis, it was found that privately sponsored refugees were actually less likely to receive social assistance than refugee claimants, and they were more likely to report employment income. So it seems that privately sponsored refugees, once everything is held constant, do a little bit better in the labor market than refugee claimants do. So just to conclude, in addition to this report providing an enhanced foundational knowledge on the economic outcomes of refugee claimants who do not have permanent resident status, the findings also hint at the economic vulnerability of this group. So as we saw in the previous slides, the labor market outcomes for claimants continuously increase with time, but eventually deteriorate for those who do not gain permanent resident status. And that might not be a particularly shocking finding for many of you. I think it might be fairly obvious that permanent resident status does provide a huge advantage in the labor market, and that refugee claimants that become permanent residents will do better than those that don't. However, from IRCC side, I do want to emphasize again that this is the first time we've been able to quantify those findings, and that's the first step when applying this type of research in the policy development space. So I do think there's still a value added there in terms of how we can further build on this research. We also noticed, again, going back to that multivariate analysis finding, that privately sponsored refugees do a little bit better, and that there are some unobserved factors that weren't captured in our model that show privately sponsored refugees doing a bit better. And to discuss what those unobserved factors may be, the first thing that comes to mind is that as sponsored refugees, privately sponsored refugees have the benefit of accessing their sponsorship networks, which can be huge when it comes to the labor market. Having your sponsor help you fill out job applications or potentially link you with a potential job. So those are things that we can expect to impact your outcomes. We also noted that for privately sponsored refugees, like government-assisted refugees, they have access to federally funded settlement services immediately after arrival. In comparison, for refugee claimants, they only have access to those services, federally funded services, I should highlight, only after they become permanent residents. So that could also be a factor to explain why their outcomes may not be as strong in the long term as privately sponsored refugees. Just to finally conclude, I do want to say that this is our first step into analyzing the labor market activity of refugee claimants before they become permanent residents. And going forward, this is an area that we want to continue to monitor and analyze. And we want to continue to look at it, not just from an economic standpoint, but also socially as well. I see Cédric's and we're done. This is the conclusion. Thank you all for listening and attending the workshop. I would invite you all to read the full report, which is now available on Statistics Canada's website. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Yasmin. So thank you to all of you. So before going to the Slido, because we have exactly 15 minutes, so we were like, it was perfectly timed as usual. I wanted to give my excuses to Fang, because Fang, I didn't remember you are in many papers and a collaborative project with you, but I didn't quote your name. So you can also answer some question regarding the immigrant outcomes during COVID-19, because you were a co-author with Drew. So sorry for that. Otherwise, I think it's a lot of knowledge to absorb. I know I saw some comments, some people say, oh yeah, can you go slower? I think some were slower or faster than others. It's a difficult exercise. We cannot react to the crowd. We are alone almost, so we did our best. But the good thing is like it has been recorded, so you can listen to it later. Also, all the decks will be available, and the paper will be are already in fact on the Statistics Canada website. So I hear your kudos and applauses. So yeah, yes, thank you. They are happy to hear your applauses. And without further delay, so I look at the Slido later. We take the question in order. So the first question for Drew and Fang. Someone is wondering if you looked at other labor market outcomes, unemployment, working time, part-time work, earnings, etc. So Fang, Drew, maybe les dames d'abord, maybe Drew first, and then Fang, if you want to add something.
Yes, we did look into other labor market outcomes, such as the employment rate and working time, like the share and half of usual hours. And we do get some descriptive results based on these measures. And we also have an unpublished these results. However, the major shortcoming of use these measures is that it doesn't allow us to conduct a multivariate analysis to examine how the job characteristics can explain the different outcomes between immigrants and the Canadian-born. So for example, this is mainly available for those who are employed in the service. So if we want to do the multivariate analysis for the employment rate, the problem like we cannot make fully use of the industry information here. And also for the traditional measure, unemployment rate, this measure actually under this crisis, the measure has very significant limitations in describing the impact of this crisis. So because like many of those without a job or looking for a work or shift from employment straight to the non-participant without passing through the state of the unemployment. Also with the COVID-19 closures, many of those with jobs may work less hours than usual due to children's responsibility and other issues associated with work from home arrangements. That's why like the working time seems some more of a popular measure to describe the impacts of this crisis. And Feng, do you have anything
I think
else to add it? Thank you.
It's well said. I don't have anything to add.
Perfect, thank you. And I think, Drew, you speak so fast that you are too fast for your own bandwidth. So sometimes it's freezing, but that's great. Thank you. We are gaining time. Another question now for Hayden. Given all the benefits of two-step selection, do you think we should select all economics immigrants from among temporary foreign workers? That's a good one.
Yes, that's a great question. That's sort of the natural question to come out of this paper. We would argue it's not desirable to apply two-step selection to all economic immigrants. We think it's imperative to keep room for some strategic recruitment, through other selection avenues. We want to think about immigrants with skills in the medium and long term. In our presentation, we talked about how the Canadian system has a built-in mechanism to mitigate some of the potential challenges with the two-step. And that is that the government maintains control in the second step. So why do we want that? Because one of the key jobs of the government is to maintain an aspect of the immigration selection system that's aimed, at the long-term competitiveness, the human capital development. I would argue, or we would argue, that two-step immigration is not always the solution, but it is obviously a great tool in the toolbox. I don't know if Feng wants to add anything to that.
Yes, I think another point is that like it's Ethan present the numbers show that now we like 50 to 60% of the economic principal applicants are selected through temporary foreign workers. So if we expanding that share to the could even higher share of principal applicants from temporary foreign workers, we probably need to further increase the number of temporary foreign work to get like actually quantify the economic immigrants, which that probably going to create even more problem because when you keep increasing the size of temporary foreign workers, you also have an issue with labor market demand and how temporary foreign workers themselves can do well in the labor market.
Thank you to both. I hope it's answering the question. I just wanted to add that our immigration model has always been based on human capital factors, so long-term factors. So in a way, temporary foreign workers are answering certainly have good outcomes, but it's kind of derailing the purpose of the human capital model. So we have to be careful. And in the deck, in the paper, you will be there with some benefits as Hayden presented, but also some risk. I think, I don't know how they were called, but some challenges with a temporary foreign worker, even if it's for sure a great benefit now. Another question, I think in this race, it was not Yasmin, but Yasmin came back in front. So if you're ready. Yasmin, do you have any idea of the reason behind such gaps in employment earnings between refugees, claimants, and GARs or PSRs?
Sorry, I'm just looking at the question now. Let me pull up the slide.
Not clear enough?
Okay, so do you have any idea on the reasons behind gaps? I mean, it would all kind of be speculative, I guess. It would depend on, different cohorts have different, as you saw, socio-demographic characteristics. So nothing I can say definitively. I know within IRCC, any research that we've published in the past that looks at refugee claimants after they become permanent residents, so once they become refugees landed in Canada, we see that they do perform much better than privately sponsored refugees and government-assisted refugees. And when we look at that specific type of analysis, it's always important to note that protected persons in Canada, which we often refer to as former asylum claimants, have oftentimes been in the labor market for many years prior to becoming permanent residents, and that will impact their outcomes in terms of what their first year in the labor market is. So while resettled refugees are kind of looking at their actual first year in the labor market, a lot of the research that we've had at IRCC shows that protected persons in Canada do much better, but only because they've had a bit of an advantage or pre-Canadian experience, I guess. In terms of prior to, I wouldn't be able to definitively say on why refugee claimants are doing much better. That's definitely an area for further research that I hope to take on in the future.
Thank you very much. Eden, again, what are the occupational classification of the two-step versus FSW? To the person understanding, for FSW selection are highly accredited than two-step. So it's not totally clear, but are more accredited than two-step. So occupational classification of the two-step transition people versus the, for instance, FSW.
Yes, I mean, there are occupational, if I'm understanding the question properly, it's sort of asking about, you know, the difference in skills between the two groups, and perhaps even the differences in occupations. And there are differences. We know that, for instance, if we look at federal skilled workers and provincial nominees, there's a higher share of, like, you know, if you look at, say, the top 30 occupations of federal skilled workers, you're going to have a lot more managers, and then a lower share in, you know, services and sales. And whereas the opposite is true for P&P, you're going to have a higher share in services and sales, and a smaller share in management occupations. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question. It's a little unclear, but yes, there are differences. And that is part of the explanation. I think you'll recall in the presentation, we talked about how P&P earnings growth, you know, wasn't, it was lower than federal skilled workers by the fifth year. And we think one of the reasons for that might be exactly that the P&Ps are selected into more lower medium skilled occupations, and those occupations don't see the same earnings growth over time as some of the more highly accredited, if you want to call it, occupations. Again, Feng might have a lot to add to this, so I'll pass it over to him.
Yeah, so I'm not totally understand the question, but first of all, I want to say that quite like at least 20% of federal school workers also were also selected through the two-step selection. Like that is share actually like increased quite a lot after 2015, when the express entrance system gave like more points to Canadian work experience in the selection points. So as a result of that, I think the number is almost reached 50-60% for federal school work who went through the two-step selection since the express entrance system. Before that, I think the question talk about the credit process. I think it's early 2000s. For example, there was a requirement for foreign education assessment. That's like a requirement, mandatory for federal school work, but it was not required for Canadian work experience class or P&P. But we have done some work, look at the, like say, distribution between different classes of immigrants. What basically shows, as like Ethan said, for federal school work, there tends to be their actual occupation after came to Canada tends to be on like two ends. Like many of them are doing highly skilled jobs, but there's also a large proportion of them are doing low skilled job. On average, actually, P&P is kind of in the middle and lower end of the occupational distribution.
Thank you, Eden and Feng. So I think we have 2 minutes. So Yasmin, there is 2 short questions for you, or if you could have a short answer. One is easy, the one you please be short. So first one is like, where beaver considered in this research? And I know you will answer. And the other one maybe is like, are there many refugee claimants who stay in Canada as refugee claimants for 10 years and more?
So for the first question, beavers were not considered in the study. So the period of analysis that was included was from 2003 until 2016. So the beaver program only came into effect in 2013. However, a bit of advertisement for the Policy Research Division. We are undertaking a project that looks at the labor market outcomes of beavers and comparing them to other resettled refugees that landed during this period. So that is forthcoming, and we will be happy to share those results when we know more. For the second question, and this is a question that comes up all the time, because how is it that a refugee claimant that, you know, has been in Canada for 10 years, still filing taxes, you know, assuming they've received a negative decision on their claim? And to first, the question of, are there many? The answer is no. When you look at the study sample size, from those who initiated a claim in 2003 and who was still filing taxes in 2016, the vast majority became permanent residents. So we were looking at a size of, I think it was just over 6,000 for those who became permanent residents, and it was about 150 for those that did not become permanent residents during the study period. In terms of how they're able to remain in Canada, there are several ways, avenues of legal recourse, I should say, for claimants who receive a negative decision that all will delay removal orders. So you can appeal to the Refugee Appeal Division, judicial review, a pre-removal risk assessment. So there's a number of different things, and many can take more than 10 years. So that I hope answers the question.
Thank you very much, Yasmin, and good marketing for the beaver study. Okay, so it's time now. Sorry for there was one question I can just answer. What prevents the federal government from creating projects that support refugees claimants like those supporting GARs and PSRs? That will be, I guess, more a question for my policy colleagues, so I won't answer. For the other question, we have a look, but now we are past 30 seconds. So thank you very much to all the presenters for this new way of presenting at P2P conferences. And if you wish, we may be back next year. So thank you, Feng, Rebeka, Drew, Yasmin, and Eden, and Ben, who were the tech guy who was helping us in this new way of doing things. So thank you for your interest and your patience, and hope to see you soon. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir. Bonne soirée.